Well, really happy to have Chris Ramsey join me here on UAP, host of the Debriefed podcast from his Area 52 channel. Chris, thanks for joining me here on UAP. This is great.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. And I'm glad we got to meet up at Contact in the Desert. This is the first time we've ever kind of got to say hello to each other. And from there, this interview kind of spawned. So I'm glad it worked out that way. Actually, on that note, just your thoughts, since we're a little bit removed from Contact in the Desert. I know that was my first time there. I think it was your first time there. What were your thoughts coming out of there?
It was great. Phenomenal. Nice to meet, some of the community, some of the people I interact with online. To, meet them in person was always fun. And then obviously, it was quite a difference. I went to, I think December, I was at like the was the congressional hearing, and I was with Jesse Michaels, and he was just getting bombarded, and I was kind of a fly on the wall, which wasn't the case at Contact. I mean, it was the case for Jesse again. He was also getting bombarded,
right?
But I was also, just a lot of people were really excited about the show, and they're big fans. So that was a nice surprise for me, getting to interact with some of the people that watch the podcast, and being able to see their faces was pretty cool.
Yeah, no, same for me. It was really just a cool experience to have that actual human interaction, right? Rather than a keyboard and a screen.
Definitely.
It was really fun. But something that I have always kind of found fascinating about your path and your career is not only are you a great magician, which I saw firsthand, by the way, and I'm still trying to figure out how you did those tricks at the table that day. But to kind of delve into the UFO topic, what brought you to that? Because to kind of, I guess, evolve from the magician side of things, which obviously you still do, so it's not like you stopped, but also to add the UFO topic under your belt. What kind of brought that about for you?
It was kind of, I think I've always been fascinated with this stuff anyways. Like since I was a kid, I was I'd follow all the stories that led down, various paranormal paths, especially around psychic stuff and aliens. I watched Fire in the Sky when I was 9 years old, which, really got me hooked in the subject, because there's a giant disclaimer at the beginning of that movie that says this is based on a true story. And for a 9-year-old, you're having an adult telling you the aliens are real. You kind of take that to the bank, so to speak. And so I was always really interested in growing up. Even I remember when YouTube was coming around, before I started posting on YouTube, so over a dozen years ago, I was falling down all sorts of rabbit holes with Bill Cooper and Phil Schneider and Bob Lazar and all this. So really heavily interested in the topic. And then a few years ago, a friend of mine, Nelson Dallas, who's a memory champion, had told me about this sort of program that he was involved in where he was being trained to remote view for like some hedge fund for like the stock market or something. And I was like, that's a wild thing to tell me as a magician, because I'm a skeptic when it comes to these things. And so I wanted to learn more, went down the rabbit hole. And yeah, the rest is history. I started, documenting my journey through remote viewing, through the gateway process as well, the out of body stuff, and then just ended up creating a whole new channel separate from magic, and really immersed myself into this venture, completely almost separating myself from everything else I was doing on YouTube, and solely focused on this.
Yeah, that's so cool, man. I mean, do you feel like it was a leap of faith for you to kind of say, geez, I'm going to kind of delve into this? Like, it was something that you've been interested in, and kind of like, in your private life, you speak to your friends about it, you find things out on your own time. Was it that kind of leap of faith for you to say, I'm going to put myself out there? And did that worry you?
Didn't worry me so much in terms of putting myself out there. I never really, I'm a magician, man. Like, I've already put myself out there to a lot of the people I know. You know what I mean? Like when you're like, I'm going to be a magician, people are like, you might as well tell them you're going to be a pirate. That I was never fazed by what other people thought. I don't consider this realm to be, of the impossible. So for me, it's not as ridiculous as it may sound to some other people. And if it does sound ridiculous to some people, I just think they're ill-informed. It wasn't that much of a stretch, but to make the leap from having a cemented career as a magician on YouTube into a completely different topic, yeah, that did take a bit of a, leap of faith, but I believe in the vision that, I'm creating right now, and I don't see any other way of doing it. So, for me, it's this way or the highway, I guess. Yeah.
Well, I think it's great, man. I know a lot of people agree with me, so keep it up.
Thank you.
That's my take on it. Where do you see by the way, there's a lot of stuff you said there with the remote viewing things that I want to touch on that was like, whoa, that's 1, 2, 3, 4 things that caught my ear. But I'm wondering, where do you see the parallel for yourself when it comes to your experience with magic and how you perform, and maybe even some of the deception that's used during different tricks? Where do you see the off ramp from the magic side of things to the UFO topic? Do you see parallels with those two conversations sometimes?
Definitely. Yeah, there's multiple associations that one can make through magic and the UFO space. One being obviously, if we're looking at psyop in terms of psyop, they use the same techniques magicians do, but they use it for nefarious reasons. So, on a spectrum of being fooled, the positive side would look like a magic trick and the negative side would look like a psyop, right? So it's kind of the same tactics used for different goals. So yeah, there's definitely an overlay there. I went in Washington when I was down there, actually, I went to the Spy Museum and I was
Oh,
there with Jesse. And it was interesting because I was walking around and I was like, this is just magic tricks. Like there's so many, like, whether it's like the things that are hidden in their shoes or in their trench coats, or, there's a radio that looks like a rock that they're hiding. Like this is all just magic to me. It's all just magic tricks. And if you go to a magic shop or you're familiar with, how magic tricks work, you'll recognize a lot of these things. And there's even a guy, John Mulholland, in the 50s who was hired by the CIA to teach them about misdirection and legerdemain and sleight of hand. And so he wrote a manual for the CIA back in the 50s on how to sort of, hide something that they might need to hide if they were undercover or that type of thing. So there's always been a connection there, I think. And I'm actually aware of certain magicians who've consulted for, these 3-letter agencies. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Apollo Robbins, who's like the world's best pickpocket, was often used as in a consulting role, I think.
that's wild.
But naturally that, they would do that. They would hire people who've studied misdirection and showmanship and suggestion and all these things very intensely. Like, I mean, they have a big budget. They're going to use it for, their own personal gain. So yeah, naturally they would turn to, magicians to want to learn stuff. So it's no surprise that there is an overlap there. I will be, I think it's quite obvious. And in terms of everything else, here's the other connection that I made with magic is that during magic performances, magicians will often tell you, if you ask them to let you in, like ask them if they've ever performed a miracle, and every magician will have a story for you, at least one, but they'll probably have plenty. And the stories are usually pretty wild. Like they're like astronomical in terms of odds. Something just worked out. Two people had the same birthday, and then this happened, and then he named the card that she had. And these little tiny miracles tend to happen quite a bit. And it's interesting because Russell Targ, who, famously started Stargate and the whole SRI, Stanford Research Institute, looking into remote viewing. Well, he started his interest in psi ability due to the fact that he was a stage magician. So he would do things on stage and quickly realize that there was sort of this psychic event happening sometimes. And that triggered his curiosity enough to want to go into psi research. And so, yeah, there is that as well. There is that overlap. So there's a lot of things that you can connect magic to, but I think just like many other art forms, you'll find that they're present in the things that you're passionate about. You'll just kind of pick up on that. But yeah, magic specifically, I think is inherently linked to a lot of the things that, that are secret. Magicians, that's their commodity is secrecy. So 3-letter agencies, I would say the same.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I mean, there are definitely a lot of parallels there for sure. It's pretty cool to hear how you see those connections. And speaking of the psyop and kind of the, I guess, deception part of things, something that happened recently from the Wall Street Journal. A lot of people have kind of used those words, deception, psyop, from the article that came out with the Wall Street Journal recently, basically saying that everything you've ever seen with UFOs is a lie. It's all been drummed up by the government to distract from different top secret programs. Now, while some of that might be the case, and I'll admit that maybe that is sometimes the case, they're basically saying that's it, that's the case. What was your reaction when you heard about that article just a few days ago?
I mean, yeah, let me go ahead and ignore every experiencer ever. Like,
Right.
it doesn't matter. It's no surprise. I think anybody surprised by this is, fooling themselves, because this has happened time and again. This isn't the first time this has happened.
Yeah.
This is a repeatable offense by legacy media. They keep doing this. So I don't waste my time on it. I don't really care. I don't think that they have a valuable opinion on the matter. I don't think anything they have to say is pertinent to the conversation, put it that way. And I don't think they ever have. You know, so when we talk about quote unquote disclosure and all this stuff, I check out when it comes to, I'll admittedly, sometimes I'll read an article or a newspaper and get excited or hear about, this hearing that's happening and this type of thing. But then I kind of shake my head and I go, no, hold on a second. There's so much more to this topic that doesn't revolve around, all of the government players and the contractors and the media. There's so much more in this topic that's filled to the brim with interesting facts and actual, evidence, whether anecdotal or, physical, from the things that have happened to people, all sorts of things that you can take literally. So when I see articles like this, I don't care. I think what it does is, when people focus on things like this, or even individuals in the space, we hear these stories of somebody saying one thing and then been proven wrong, or, people get so caught up on the minutia of this stuff that you forget what it is we're after. Like, this shouldn't matter, right? Take this as a piece of information, take everything they've written down, absorb it, read it, catalog it, and move on. Don't hinge your belief system on a newspaper article, and don't hinge your belief system on a whistleblower or an experiencer, or anything. Just take the information in, catalog it, move on.
And it tends to become tribal, right? I mean, I might think I'm wrong in saying that, especially when it comes to social media. Like, the UFO community, from what I've noticed anyway, seems to be tribal in some cases, where it's like, well, I'm on this guy's team, on that guy's team. I believe her, I don't believe him. He's that, she's that. Do you see that same thing sometimes?
Yeah. I mean, that's just belief systems in general, so anytime you believe something, you're automatically put into a category. So, whether it's, I believe so-and-so, or I don't believe so-and-so, or I believe what he said, or I believe what she saw, or I believe, what's going on here, I believe this is the answer. Like, those are all groups that you put yourself in. And once you start believing or not believing, you just end up defending your resolve. And I think that can be to your own detriment. I think, this a topic so vast and incredible and fantastical, I think deserves pause a little bit. I think we should take a step back and stop, jumping to conclusions and just absorbing information, and maybe resign to the idea that in this lifetime, we might not have all the answers. That's okay. We can just keep seeking, this information out and keep accumulating it, and hopefully come to some type of sound hypothesis. But we don't have to say, I believe something. We could say, hey, that sounds true, or that rings true for me, or I'm, my conviction is low to middle on this, and that's okay.
Right.
But to say I believe and putting all your eggs in one basket, I think that's a mistake.
Yeah, I think that's fair. On the Wall Street Journal thing, real quick, I'm just wondering, do you think that comes out because, and like you said, these things have happened since the retraction from Roswell, where they said it was a weather balloon. I mean, this has been going on for 80 years. But this specific one, do you think that article comes out that, and it gets pushed, by the way, it gets pushed by the mass media, by the mainstream media, as, oh wow, look at this bombshell article from the Wall Street Journal. So they had, it seemed to me anyway, kind of like their cronies, so to speak, in their mainstream media friends to push that narrative. Do you think that happens, Chris, because some of us are over the target with a lot of these conversations, so they felt like they needed to fire back a little bit, or is it just they did it and this was the time they did it?
Yeah, your guess is as good as mine. It sounds true, sounds like I wouldn't put it past them, if that's I think you look at these agencies, we all know what they're capable of, and so it's no surprise, really.
Yeah.
I'd be surprised if they leaned into it more rather than leaned against it. It actually makes more sense to me that they would do this than like something like the 2017 New York Times article.
Right.
This makes way more sense for
It does.
legacy media. I'm way less suspicious of legacy media now
Right.
than with that 2017 article.
Yeah, this fits their mold more, for sure.
Yeah, when the government starts leaning into, no, we have, here's like, that's where I'm like, well, hold on a second. Same guys who've been bullshitting us for, decades. So when I see this, I go, yeah, okay, cool, I guess, but it's not going to deter me. It might give some, I guess, skeptics or otherwise people who were on the fence. It might, give them a little bit of fodder in terms of disbelief, which is fine. And that's cool. But again, if you're hinging your own personal view and ontology on a news article, I think that's a mistake anyways. So if
Yeah.
this is the drop that overflowed the bucket for you in terms of being, one way or the other, then I think you probably got bigger problems.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, there's so much out there that can be pointed to or spoken about, one of which is remote viewing. And you mentioned it a couple of times. And this is a subject that has fascinated me for a long time. Actually, it's a subject that got me in to ufology to begin with when I was around like 20 or something. I heard about Edgar Casey, and from there it was just all in learning about this stuff. So when it comes to the remote viewing portion, guys like Joe McMonicle, when he's remote viewing for the CIA, what is your big takeaway when we talk about remote viewing? Whether it's Joe McMonigle, where he says he saw a civilization on Mars 1,000,000 years ago, or it's something, where he's seen people on a Russian submarine in the case of Red October, when they made the movie about it. I mean, what can we take away? Because it's so fantastical, remote viewing. What can people take away from that who just aren't used to the idea of something like that being true?
Yeah. There's a lot of data. So, anybody who doesn't want to acknowledge the data, I mean, that's totally up to you, but you can't say something doesn't exist if there's data on it existing, So, from Dr. Edwin May, the chief research physicist at SRI during Stargate, he's got 30 years of data on 6 people. And it points to this being a thing. There's so much other data that exists on remote viewing that's available publicly. That's not hidden at all.
Yeah.
And you don't have to go to a CIA website. Like there are books published on this stuff that shows there is a significant phenomenon here. Like there's an effect happening, and it stands way above the targeted p-value system that is required for this stuff to be acknowledged. And so it's constant goalpost shifting when it comes to, parapsychology. We're aware of that. But I've, I don't hinge any of my belief systems on things that I've read or stories that I've been told. I try it for myself, and that's something I did for a year. And I showed myself that it was possible. I'm not by any means a gifted individual when it comes to this stuff, but it was enough to tell me that there is something here.
That's interesting.
And yeah.
What kind of experience did you have?
I mean, I documented the entire thing. We had a target in an envelope that I was blind to, and I would describe the target that was in the envelope, the image, and then draw. And many times it would be very close. And, I could have drawn a bumblebee or a bicycle, and it happened to be the exact same thing. So not only, it could have been a place, a person, or I don't know, a mountain or a house or a blue lollipop or anything. And so when you get hits that are like, oh, this is a volcano and this is a volcano, and then I'm describing like sulfurous smells and like heat and like all these things, then it's a volcano and I've drawn that. It's you're kind of like, whoa, that's incredible. And you don't necessarily believe it at first, and then you do it over and over and over, and you keep getting similar sort of results. Now, again, I'm not by any means like a really gifted individual when it comes to stuff, but I've seen other people do really well on it as well. And then, as you mentioned, Joe McMonicle, he was remote viewer number 001. Early on, he was tasked with a few targets to determine his talent in remote viewing. And he had 5 first place targets out of 6, which is the highest score anyone's ever scored for one of these tests. And basically a first place, so a fourth place, there's 4 places. A fourth place is if the target is a bumblebee and I draw a paper plate, right? Completely off. A third place is if it's a bumblebee and I draw something that's yellow and black and maybe fuzzy.
Okay.
But it's just a ball, and I don't really say it's a life form. So that's a third place. Second place is if I drew like a wasp.
Okay.
Right. And a first place is if I drew a bumblebee.
Yeah.
And so he had 5 first place matches out of 6.
Wow.
And those are test conditions. In fact, Dr. Edwin May was tasked to put together a scientific oversight committee that had to come up with the tests to make sure that they were lab, approved. And so he had like a dozen of the who's who in psychology and science and physics of the United States put together these tests, including Nobel Prize winners.
Right.
Dr. Schwartz, who discovered, I think it was like the particle beam, like, and I mean, so many other people, including parapsychologists, but also just regular psychologists. And so there was an incredible amount of rigor when it came to these tests. And they did this for 20 years. And every single year, Joe McMonicle had to go in front of an oversight committee himself at like a congressional oversight to approve the budget. So he had to perform in a skiff. He had to do remote viewings for these individuals from Congress so that they approved the budget for the next year. And time and time again, he was able to do that, right? So you don't approve something if it doesn't work. And, on top of that, they had 505 missions over 20 years. So 505 individual missions. 17 out of the 19 intelligence agencies were involved in these missions, including, I think, the Joint Task Force, 142 times they came back to use remote viewings. And a lot of that was to intercept like drug boats on the coast. And so, you look at these numbers, the data's out there. They obviously still do this. This isn't
right.
They did it before Stargate. They had Sunstreak, Center Lane, a whole bunch of other ones. And they closed those down when people found out about them and opened up a new one. And that's exactly what they did in 1996. And they still, said, oh, it didn't work. And then 2017, when they declassified a whole bunch of stuff, you can see that a lot of them did work. And they did use a lot of that stuff to find hostages, to, as Joe McMonicle found, was a General Dozier in Italy who was kidnapped. And they used him and other intel, but they did use the remote viewing intel, and it was valuable. And it did help them find, this general who is behind enemy lines. Like, I mean, there's so many cases, but again, if you're inclined to not wanting to look into it, that's on you. But the information is out there. I've studied it intensely. And, to me, it's just a matter of fact now that there is something there. Now, what it is, how it works, what's the mechanism behind it, how accurate is it? Like, all of these things are questions that are still up in the air and that a lot of these people are still studying. But for me, I know it to be real. I don't have to believe in it anymore or not believe in it. I've seen it. I've tried it. And there is data out there to back up what I'm saying. So, and speaking of the Wall Street Journal, they also wrote an article about how remote viewing wasn't real. And you're like, well, then your government's spending money on just a bunch of stuff that isn't real constantly. Like, that's kind of
Constantly.
wild too. That's a big story as well.
Yeah, that's fair enough. And I was going to ask you, actually, you touched on it. How do you think this happens? And again, that's a far-reaching answer and probably something that can be studied for the next 20 years on its own. But just your best guess and how you can encapsulate that. How does something as fantastical as remote viewing, how is it real? How are people able to tap into whatever they're tapping into to be able to see something past, present, or future? Someone is held hostage somewhere across the world and they're able to see it and describe it. How is that possible for people who just can't wrap their heads around it?
Yeah. They're still trying to figure that out. There's a lot of theories out there. I know that Hal Puthoff has theories about microtubules in the brain that sort of interface with this quantum field that's all sort of omnipresent, and that these microtubules will sort of like collect information from a quantum realm, which isn't beholden to time and space. Gets extremely complicated and way over my pay grade, to be honest. But one thing that Dr. May has found as well, in when they tested out people for the Army was like, we need to recruit people. We need to come up with a system on how to train them in remote viewing. Ingo Swann came up with CRV, controlled remote viewing. And out of 600 people, 1% of them showed a significant talent, right? So 6 people. And that doesn't seem like much, but that's a pretty big number when you think about it on a larger scale. And these people were people from all walks of life. You had Mensa level geniuses, you had alumni, Stanford alumni, you had intelligence people, and you had regular folk, Army guys. And all these people were tested. 1% of them showed significant talent. Turns out, after having tested all of them and after having done all of these things, turns out, by coincidence, I guess, every single person that showed significant talent was also had synesthesia. And so that's something they didn't expect. They were like, oh, so seeing sounds and hearing colors and all these, sort of variations of your senses apparently is an indicator, at least, or maybe a facilitator of this event. And so that's something new that they were looking into. And they even did tests in submarines to see if it was a frequency, because they were like, oh, maybe it's like a radio signal, which is what I thought at first. And they're like, no, we did it in a submarine where absolutely no frequency can reach. And significant results were still, shown. Even better results because they were so isolated.
Right. Yeah.
And so now this is where it gets into this quantum space. They also did tests with apparently entropy in some level makes this more possible. So they would go to, so they had the target go to a site, and the remote viewer and the tasker, the task was to remote view where the target was. He was somewhere in the world. They would get more accurate descriptions of where the target was when they poured liquid nitrogen at the site.
Wow.
So when the site had more entropy, almost as if the mind or consciousness or whatever that is able to recognize change, much like we recognize change. If you were to think of the Ganzfeld effect and you put these ping pong balls on your eyes and you listen to this frequency, after a while, you won't see the red light anymore. You won't hear the sounds anymore because our minds are kind of hardwired to detect change.
Yeah.
And so almost as if like a moth to a flame, we detect the most entropic event when it comes to remote viewing. And that also happened quite a bit with remote viewers, where they were given one target and they were like, no, hold on, there's something else here. And something bigger, more eventful was actually drawing them towards it. So yeah, a lot of really interesting studies that have come out on remote viewing. What it is exactly, I couldn't tell you, but I'm fascinated by all the work that is being done in that, space.
Yeah, you and me both. That's awesome. Last thing on that, because again, there's still so much that I have here for you. Do you think near-death experience has something to do with that, as far as heightening the senses, heightening the awareness or the ability for it? The reason I ask that is because Joe McMonicle, who we're talking about, is maybe the best remote viewer of all time, or most consequential anyway. He had a near-death experience, and he describes really that ability kind of starting after that near-death experience. So do you think that's circumstantial? Is it unique to the viewer, or is there something deeper there?
Yeah, he would say it's unrelated. I asked Joe about that. He doesn't believe the two are
Yeah, you
related
did speak to him. That's right.
because a lot of people make that connection of, having some type of NDE unlocking or sort of maybe perhaps thinning the veil between
Right.
this world and the next. And it seems, well, he says it's unrelated.
Oh,
He says that it's more likely caused by instinct. And so when he was younger, even in his book, he talks about this. He would had to defend his sister, from like an abusive, I think, father, and so that triggered a survival mechanism in him,
mm,
and so he really, really believes in this aspect of remote viewing being linked to survival. If you go back to, way back in the day when people had shamans and this type of stuff, like the person with the most reverence in a village wouldn't be the strongest person. It would be the most psychic, right? And people would bring them gifts because they would, give them information that was valuable to them. And whether that's knowing where the water was through using witching rods or where not to hunt because of predators. And so, yeah, he chalked it up to instinct. Like this is in everyone. And so when you hear about NDEs and how they sort of unlock or thin this veil, you can also make the case for any traumatic event. So not just
mm.
near death, but almost, almost like it shocks you into needing it to survive. And so that could you hear about these type of precognitive events in situations where people's life is in jeopardy, but not necessarily experiencing death.
Well,
So if they're being attacked,
yeah.
I spoke to George St. Pierre, who's an MMA fighter. He also says that during these fights, it's almost as if he knows exactly what his opponent's going to do sometimes. And so under this like stress inoculation and this survival mechanism and this adrenaline, he's able to perceive things before they happen. Now,
Hmm.
his question is it deduction or is it precognitive? And it's so close that it's really hard to tell, but that seems to be what Joe is also alluding to.
Yeah, it's really interesting, and it would help explain some of GSP's wins. I mean, the guy was an incredible fighter,
Yeah,
and maybe even
definitely.
someone like Muhammad Ali. I mean, when you watch those clips of him just dodging punches
Yeah,
left
they're
and right.
in the zone. There's
Yeah,
like it's like they're aware of something that no one else is. Yeah.
yeah, it's really interesting. On that note of like people you've had on your show, is there someone in the back of your head? Because we all have somebody that we're like, man, I really wish I can talk to that person, and maybe it's more than one. And you've spoken to a lot of people, but is there still someone in the back of your head that you're like, really want to talk to this guy, really want to talk to this girl because I just have so many questions for them and it just hasn't happened yet?
Yeah, I mean, I would love to talk to Travis Walton. I think, again, mentioning at the top of the episode, that was the movie that got me into this stuff, so I think it would be a full circle moment, definitely, to speak with Travis. Linda Moulton Howe, I think, is another one. I think she is incredible. I think she's done so much. She's just such a fearless fighter in
Yeah.
this, and say what you will about her opinions or what she does. I mean, you just can't deny the fact that she commands just respect. She's been fighting this stuff, for a very, very long time, and put herself in really shady positions a lot of times, and where her life was in danger, and so yeah, I think Linda would probably have the best stories. And I'm a sucker for a good story. So I think, yeah, Linda would definitely be on the bucket list.
No, that's great. If someone came up to you and they didn't know who you were, whatever, you're at a bar, you're at a restaurant, whatever, and it's just kind of small talk, you're like, oh, what do? You start telling them about the magic side, the UFO podcast side, things like that. And they said to you, that UFO stuff, I don't really know what to make of it. I hear about it. I see some of the videos, but I think it's kind of silly. What would you point them to? Person, story, something that you would consider a good piece of
Mm.
evidence that you would say, all right, that's fair, but just do me a favor and check out this person's story or this particular piece and see if it changes your mind.
Yeah, I think moment of contact for me.
Okay.
from James Fox.
Yeah.
I think that's one of those cases that's just like, dude, there's so much human testimony. Also, another one is in Rua, Zimbabwe. The kids at Ariel School.
Yep.
They're children. Now that one might be a little more difficult for people to get behind because not knowing the situation, it might feel like some of these kids are being coerced, which they weren't. But not knowing the situation, I do understand how people can be like, oh, they're just kids. They don't know what they're talking about, which is why, it brings me to Moment of Contact, because I think that one for me was just like so many people who don't know each other are all talking about the same thing. They weren't in one place. This was all around Virginia. And so, that and I hear little birdie tells me that James has a lot of news on a follow-up to that. So that'll be really interesting as well.
Was that little birdie named say it rhymes with Haynes Box?
That's correct. Yeah. One and the same.
I had a feeling. No, that's awesome. Because the both of those stories, I'm with you, are just two of the
What
most.
about you? What's yours?
I mean, those are great. Ariel School definitely is absolutely one of them. I think one of the ones that I come back to a lot is really kind of like the Joe McMonicle stuff. I hate to bring up something that we were just talking about, but that's somebody that is just so fascinating to me. That's actually somebody that I would like to talk to that I haven't spoken to. Because you talk about a guy that was an asset to the federal government and to the agencies and to the the intelligence agencies, and they used him for a reason, not because they didn't believe it, because what he was doing actually worked.
Mm-hmm.
And if what he's saying about bases inside mountains and seeing different beings inside mountains in Africa,
or Pat Price as well.
Right. Yes. So, I mean, we put those together. And then, of course, saying that there was a civilization on Mars 1 million years ago, it's like, well, could he be right about one, but not the other? I guess. But it's got to give you a pause. It makes you think like there's maybe something there.
There's definitely a good point. But even Joe doesn't like unverifiable targets. Well, he says he doesn't like them, but he also, talks about them a lot. But, he'll be the first to say like, yeah, I don't know. I won't hang my hat on it because I can't verify it, and that's one thing that he always found frustrating. But the things that like you said, the things that he could verify turned out to be true. So makes you wonder.
It sure does. That's for sure. Do you think there's kind of like on a different note here, Chris? I'm starting to hear more stories about poltergeist activity when it comes to the alien phenomenon, like actual close encounter experiencers, like Whitley Strieber type of person, where they're experiencing these entities one-on-one. I'm hearing more about things floating in the air. I'm hearing more about knocks on the door. I'm hearing more about scratches. These are normally things that you would hear about. I mean, I hate to say it, but these are normally things you hear more about with like demonic activity.
Sure.
Is there something connected here, do you think? Or is it two different things that people are mistaking for the alien encounter experience?
Yeah, as far as I'm concerned, why can't it be one and the same? Or maybe it's two different things. Like both answers I think are valid. I think all answers are valid until they're taken off the table. Jacques Vallée has loads and loads of thoughts on how these old stories of, the fairy people and all sorts of things also tie into this. And then you look at Diana Pasulka, a lot of work on how ancient, how people used to look up to angels in the way that we look up to UFOs and the connections there. So there's definitely some overlap, and you hear about stories from Skinwalker Ranch about, this hitchhiker effect and these poltergeist things happening after people leave the ranch. So yeah, why couldn't they be connected? For sure. And, if you're thinking, there's a lot of people out there that are like, are you crazy? It's just angels and devils. And that's the whole thing. Right. And okay, well, where do the devils come from? Right. And they'll say, well, hell. Okay. Where is hell? It's not in the ground. Right. So where is it? It's another dimension.
Yeah.
Okay. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about interdimensional beings.
Yeah.
Right. That are using portals, right, I guess, to interface with our reality in some way. So I think we're talking about the same thing. I think the verbiage might be different. And, one says devil or demon, and another says alien or interdimensional being or ultra terrestrial or what have you. or intraterrestrial or tempestrial or whatever you want to call it. I just call it aliens because it's a lot easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think why can't they be the same? Now, is there something to the idea of demons and angels? I would at first be really reluctant to think that, but the more that I look into it, the more you hear about stories of Jacques Vallée, kind of subtly hinting that is the phenomenon. And then you read books like Strange Angel, the story of Jack Parsons, who, ended up building rockets, but also sort of trying to summon demons at the same time, and then you hear about the rituals that are still going on at NASA. And so, it makes you wonder, is there something there? Is it superstition? Is it all the same thing? Is it different things? I don't know.
Man, it's a weird question though, right? Because when you start to think about even going back to biblical history, right? A lot of people talk about Ezekiel and, the wheel or the chariot of fire and all these different things. And you kind of start to make that leap a little bit to think, well, could it have been some of the same stuff, but they just didn't know how to talk about it? And you start to talk about the giants during the time of Noah. And there's just so much that it's like, how do you add it all up? And that's why I personally always feel like the spirituality question has to kind of play a part in this, because I feel like it's almost like one of those cogs that it's one of the missing pieces that might be able to connect some of this stuff. Do you think I'm off on that?
I don't know. It could be. It definitely seems like, intention drives a lot of this phenomenon, whether it's visitations or, orbs or whatever it is. It seems like there is some type of interface there. Call it spirituality, call it whatever you like, quantum physics, who knows? It's hard to categorize something that's so ephemeral and nebulous. Like, it's just really hard to pin it down to one thing, when in reality it's probably a lot of things. It's probably everything. That's, the more that I look into this, you're like, if we're talking about, it's either just us or it's everything. Like, in my head, it's not us and one other thing. If it's one other thing, then it's another thing and another thing, and it just keeps going. Like, if something in the billions of years that this planet's been around came here other than us or made us or whatever that is, some other intelligence, then I would have to assume that there is probably another one and another one, and it goes on. I'm not gonna think it's either us or us and them, and that's it. Like, I think there's probably more to it than that, and then everything in between, us and them, whatever that is. So, I don't know. Is spirituality the key? It seems like intent is the key to some of this phenomenon, but I don't know to what extent. I really don't know. And I'd be reluctant to say, if someone says, oh, it's all this or whatever, but then there's the afterlife. But I'm like, maybe the afterlife is controlled by them too. That's a dark thought. That's a weird thought.
Yeah.
That, we go to the light and it's just part of their plan, and they're also controlling that. Like, so I'm reluctant to believe anything. And I just, I don't know. We're going to find out eventually. I won't be able to report back, maybe, but yeah, I'll try.
No, come on, man. Listen, I want to promise right now that the spirit of Chris Ramsey comes on UAP to answer some damn questions here.
Houdini made that promise to his wife when he died. Right? Yeah, he was debunking a lot of mediums before his death, and told his wife that, she should continue to do that and get rid of these charlatans, and that he would come back through these mediums and give her a specific word or sentence, and until she hears that word or sentence, they're frauds. And she never heard it.
Wow. That's interesting. Man, Houdini is a fascinating character in himself. I'm sure you could probably go all day on him. He's always kind of really intrigued me over the years. Speaking of some of that, though, when it comes to maybe some of these lost arts, if you will, and we hear about, recently, like the lost chambers of the pyramids of Giza that were supposedly found by the Italian scientists and that group of scientists there. and we look back, we hear stories about Atlantis. Edgar Casey spoke about Atlantis. Do you think there was some type of ancient technology that's been lost to us, and that for whatever reason, was it the ancient Egyptians or the Atlanteans or whoever it was had this all cracked, or maybe even the Mayans, the Aztecs, somebody had all this stuff, the American Indians had this stuff figured out, and it's just been lost along the way?
Yeah, it definitely seems that way. I think if you look deep enough, you realize that it is hard to believe that there are things that we can't explain. And when you look at the precision, these bowls or these vases that they found that we couldn't even replicate with modern machinery.
Right.
Let alone forget the pyramids, dude. Forget the giant blocks. I believe that people can move giant blocks. You get enough people together, and if they crack enough whips, like that's going to happen.
Yes.
That's just the way it is.
Right.
But when it comes to like this precision stuff, that's where it gets weird. Get 1,000 people. They can move a giant stone. I believe in the power of human beings and the power of working together and creating something. But when it comes to like something small, like a borehole or like these perfect cuts and these perfect, like that's where you're like, yeah, I don't know how they would have had, according to what they were supposed to have, according to modern archaeologists, they wouldn't have had that capacity, that ability to make those things. So where does that leave you? It leads you, now you got to be careful with this, because as a magician, if I show you a trick, I am forcing you to unwillingly suspend your disbelief through a method that I create. So I'm going to make something happen, and I'm going to make it so fooling that you resign your position and you go, I don't know. It's magic. It's impossible. You don't know what to say. That's my job. So when I show people a magic trick and then ask them to explain it, if they can't explain it, the explanations they'll start coming up with start to get more and more ludicrous. Right?
Right. Okay. And this
all
is
the
that
while,
connection, right? This is that connection we were talking about earlier.
Yeah. And all the while, I know how simple it actually is.
Hmm.
And so, they'll be like, no, he had a system of magnets. And like, I'm like, you don't even know how magnets work. That's not how they work. You can't just levitate random objects with magnets or static electricity, but people will go there. And so, sometimes this is what we see when we look at these ancient structures. People, because they don't have the answer, they jump to aliens. And I'm not saying it isn't aliens or advanced tech, but I'm saying there is a gap there that we don't understand. And for all we know, the answer, once we figure it out, might turn out to be simpler than we thought. I think that's a possibility.
Yeah.
But it has eluded us to this day. And I think that is, worth questioning it. But yeah, I wouldn't jump straight to any of that stuff. But I wouldn't rule it out either.
Yeah, like you said, we still ask the questions. So I'm only a few minutes left here, Chris, and I wish I would love to talk to you again in the future, because this is a lot of fun.
Of course.
But going back to contact in the desert, you talked about doing those tricks and making us unwillfully suspend belief when it comes to the magic tricks. And gosh darn you made it happen for me, because I'm sitting there. And I painted this picture on a previous episode of UAP, but I'd love to do it with you here as well, because it's going to lead to a question. I'm sitting there at the table, which was a pretty cool moment, by the way, with you and James Fox and Thomas Jane and Jeremy Corbell and George Knapp and Matt from the Good Trouble show.
Matt Ford,
thank you.
Yeah.
Just drew a blank there for some reason. Who is great, by the way. He and I ended up speaking for like 2 hours afterward. He's a great guy. You would think I wouldn't draw a blank there, but nevertheless. So we're all sitting there at this table, and you pull out your cards and just start doing magic tricks. And you do this thing where you had all of us pick the cards. You put down 4 kings, right, of each suit, 4 corners, and we're all picking the card. And you're saying, okay, I'm taking this bunch of 5 to 7 cards, whatever it was. Where do you want me to put it, black or red? And it's up to us. And you're having us choose, and then somehow, some way, it all ends up being in the same color. They're all grouped together, all the hearts, all the How? Like, I know you're not going to answer me, but still, I'm going to ask how. How does something like that happen? It's crazy to me.
Yeah, that's the beauty about magic, is that there are many things at play during an effect like that. Whether it's sleight of hand, whether it's showmanship, whether it's verbal misdirection. There's literally so many different psychological techniques that are used within one trick, and tactile techniques. So it's a mashup of so many things, as is most every trick. People often assume, oh, you just did this. And if they only knew how much effort goes into a trick, and from all the directions that we hit it, whether it's in the things we say or where we're looking or all this, there's a lot of work that goes into this. Magic isn't as simple as you might think, but it's also incredibly simple when you break it down. But when you add all the layerings of different techniques and different principles and all these things together, it creates a nice perception of an event, which you perceive happened a certain way. Magicians are masters at engineering memory more than anything. And so even you recounting what happened wasn't what happened.
I got it wrong, didn't I?
Well, I mean, everybody would. That's the whole point of magic.
It's wild.
I can tell you to look here, and this is very important, and then say, never mind this over here. And then we keep going over here, and your brain is going to take those two important things and put them together, and it's going to discount the little never mind because it doesn't have room to store all this useless information. Well, that never mind might be the secret. And this very important stuff was completely useless and nonsensical.
Right.
So you're going to tell a story, and you're going to omit that little never mind because I told you to never mind it, and it doesn't matter.
Right.
And so your story is not at all what happened, but I was able to engineer that experience, and memory is the only thing that really drives our reality. So if you can manipulate memory, and it's easier than you think, it happens to experiencers all the time as well. We talk about, I find there's a significant comparison to be made between someone who witnessed a magic trick and someone who's seen a UFO. They're both impossible. They both defy explanation. And immediately after, the memory is different, is altered for a few reasons. One, because, well, maybe the magician altered your memory on purpose. But other than that, you're trying to convey emotion. You're trying to make the other person feel as if they were there. And so you're not giving them just straight facts, because that's boring. You're rounding off the edges a little bit. Right. And you're doing that for another reason as well. You don't want to appear like you're easily fooled. So you're going to make the situation a little bit more impossible, as if you double checked everything, even though you didn't. And even though you know that even if you did, it would have been fine. But you add those little pieces of information in to make it more convincing, because, again, you want them to feel like they were there. Yeah. So it's a human flaw, and it's not of malicious intent, but it's something that we all do. And, magicians just happen to take advantage of this during magic performances.
It's great stuff, man. You mentioned earlier about the miracles. That's every magician has a miracle. Now, you told this story, and I don't mind hearing it again, because I want you to tell everyone else who hasn't heard this story. You were talking about your miracle. Actually, Dan Cleary, who was also at that table, asked you, okay, Chris, what's your miracle as a magician? And it had to do with, I believe, a cell phone and a bartender.
Yeah. Yep. And there's many. I mean, I have a lot of them. And some of them I performed there. I did some of that there. And the people involved know what I'm talking about, because they witnessed it. It's when you leave things up to chance and odds, it seems like in a certain state, whether that's this like misplaced confidence, and then, but also high, no backup. So high stress, but also this like flow state. It's like this weird balance of all this. These things tend to happen. So I was in Bermuda with some friends. This is a few years ago. And again, this is one example, and I could give you a dozen examples. And every magician, by the way, if you ever meet a magician, ask them to tell you about a miracle. They will gladly regale you with like the most impossible thing. They're going to chalk it up to chance. I think there's something more at play. But I was with some magician friends, and we were shuffling cards and got the attention of this group of people. They came over, they said, "Oh, you're magicians. Can you show us something?" I said to this girl, I was like, "Yeah, sure. Hand me your phone. I'm going to try to, open your passcode." And she goes, "Oh my God, okay." So she gives me her phone. I place it on the bar. At this point, I know her passcode. I won't tell you how I know her passcode,
I
but
was just about to ask, but
as a magician, I know her passcode
good.
through some type of method. But the magician in me doesn't just open her phone. I want to play it as a magician, right? A magician is you're an actor playing the part of a magician, right? So
Showmanship.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I want to make this experience special. So I'll say, cool. So what we're gonna do, and I'll jazz this sometimes. I don't even know where I'm going with this when I start with these things, but I'll go, I'm not gonna open your phone. He is, and I point to the bartender. Again, misplaced confidence. No business being this confident about this. I know maybe the back of my mind, that if he doesn't open it, I know the passcode. I'll just I'll tell it to him in his ear. He can open it. So I don't know. I'll figure it out. But I'm really confident that he's going to open the phone. And so I point to him. Now, in my head, I'm like, I'm going to try and direct him, towards the number somehow with some intention. I don't know. I'll figure it out. So I said, go ahead and put 4 numbers in. It's a 4-digit passcode. I said, put 4 random numbers in. He does this. Tense situation. Everybody's like, oh my God, phone doesn't open. Release of tension. I'm like, of course not. That would be silly if that worked. That'd be a miracle.
Right.
And then I said, you know what? I think it's more of a personal number. Now, at this point, I know the number. It looks like a birthday. So I assume it's a personal number. When people choose numbers that isn't a pattern, it's usually personal, right?
Sure.
So it's just kind of a given. And so I said, I think it's a personal number. And I said to the guy, I said, go ahead and I think I said, put in your passcode or your birthday, or it was one or the other. Might have been your passcode. I said, go ahead. No, it was your birthday. I said, go ahead and put in your birthday. And he puts in his birthday and the phone opens.
And this isn't his phone. It was
no. And he was just as surprised as everybody else. He was surprised. I was more surprised than anybody.
Amazing.
Because they're like, this is a magician. This is supposed to happen. At some level. I'm like screaming on the inside. And I got to play cool.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So not only did they have the same birthday, that was also his passcode on his phone. He had the same passcode, same birthday, same date of birth, exactly as the other person. Kind of worked out that way. But these things happen over and over and over. And yeah, I mean, it's just one miracle after another when you put yourself in those positions. And magicians know what I'm talking about. Again, to bring this back to the beginning, it's the reason Russell Targ got into the psi field, because he saw this happen over and over again. And so I was glad to find out that I wasn't alone in observing this.
That's insane, man. And that one thing I wanted to ask you when you told that story at Contact in the Desert was, I can understand, maybe, well, actually I don't understand, but maybe it's something as far as some different ticks or movement towards numbers on the phone that would clue you off to what her code was. But how the hell would you know that the bartender has the same birth date? How does that? I guess that's the miracle, right?
Yeah, I didn't. I had no idea. I pointed to a person. I could have pointed to anyone. And that was, that was the cool part about it. It was just like this weird synchronicity. And, maybe it is a numbers game, and the more tricks you perform, the more miracles happen. But they do seem to happen disproportionately, in a disproportionate amount of times, like compared to not happening. So when you take big risks in magic, you tend to get rewarded, especially in certain conditions. And it seems to be the way it is. Yeah.
That's wild. All right. Last question. And I want you to be honest with me on this. Not that you have been dishonest at any point, but especially on this one.
Okay.
Okay. I mentioned everybody. We were all sitting together at that table of Contact in the Desert. I mentioned all the names. The documentarian in me wanted to say, hey guys, this is a pretty cool moment with like everybody at this table. I would love to take a picture and show everybody, hey, this is pretty cool. Like we're all kind of sitting here hanging out. But I didn't do it because I felt like I would have been weird and I would have been that guy. If I had done it, would everybody have looked at me as weird and this guy, he's that guy?
No.
Oh, see, now I regret it.
I think it's totally cool. Totally fine, dude. I mean, maybe somebody, I don't know. I wouldn't have found it weird. I think it's fine. Whatever.
That was cool.
I would have liked to see that picture.
And now it's lost to history.
I think Dan Cleary took a photo, maybe of partial, amount of the group. Yeah, but I mean, yeah, first, dude, why not? You live once, man. Like, don't worry about other people. Don't worry about what they're thinking. If they have a problem with it, they got a problem with their own stuff. It's not your problem.
All right. Well, now next year, okay? We'll all have to get back together next year, and
Yeah.
then we'll do it then.
And I'm gonna be like, oh, this guy again.
This guy out of here.
Yeah, what is he doing? He's one of those.
Come on, weirdo. You got to check out Chris Ramsey. If you haven't already, check out Chris Ramsey YouTube channel. I don't have to say, go ahead, tell everybody where they can find you if they haven't.
Yeah, Area 52 on YouTube. Appreciate it, Stephen. This has been a really great conversation. I enjoyed meeting you. And yeah, good luck with the podcast, man. I'm a new fan, so you know, I'd like to see you keep going, keep growing, and keep trying to find those answers, dude.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And thanks for doing this. Honestly, just a great time to be able to go back and forth about all this. I really enjoy it. So many different aspects that we can talk about. So yeah, hopefully we can do it again in the future. And thanks again for coming on.
Absolutely.
Chris Ramsey, thanks for coming on here to UAP.